we've got a great panel here, and it's identified in your program. If you haven't picked up one of these little gems, we have that up on the table and back. Our moderator for the second panel on wind, sun, water, and wires, the future of clean. Our moderator is Rod Kuckro of E&E News, and I need say no more. Rod has been a veteran reporter in the energy space for a long time, and we have a distinguished panel. Again, please remember, if you have questions, and I hope you do, use the mics on the side of the room. Thank you. Rod?
Thank you, Jim. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Bonjour, bienvenue. Toujours, nous sommes tous les fans de Washington. Today we're all fans of the Washington Nationals. And for you Canadians out there, you'll remember they really are the Montreal Expos. So, in a small way, if they win the World Series, I think you'll take a share of that. If you haven't already, as a favor, please silence your cell phones, because that can be disruptive, as you know. So by any measure, the state of the renewable industry today has never been better. Some data points. I was just talking to Lanny Nickel from SPP. SPP just hit 76% penetration for wind and hydro within the past several days. And that's an incredible number. And they've been doing it all with organic internal engineering expertise. But let's look at some other things that have happened. As we know, in some places, in many places now, the price of renewables is on par or even cheaper than natural gas combined cycle turbines. And in April, EIA reported that for the first time, the output of renewables for electric power generation surpassed coal. And they predicted that that's a pattern that will continue as coal plants continue to shutter. In more than a dozen states, as you know, many major utilities have set goals to go zero carbon by 2050. The question is, how do you really get there? It's easy to set goals. As Councilman Tonko has said before, when you don't have to be there to actually see through the implementation. But even with declining costs, public policy support in many states, and increasing customer demand, renewables could be doing better if the barriers could be overcome. We'll talk about that today. Among the key questions we're going to explore are, what are the barriers that our panelists see? Is it policies at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission? Is it state objections? Is it the reluctance of Wall Street to finance projects without certainty? Or is it just old-fashioned NIMBYism, or is it a combination of all those things? So we have a great panel to sort through this, and I want to introduce them. Many of you know them and have worked with them, but here we go. First, Amy Farrell. Raise your hand, Amy, because this is not in order of... Amy is the Senior Vice President for Government Affairs at the American Wind Energy Association. Next, we have Catherine Gensler, who's the VP of Regulatory Affairs at the Solar Energy Industries Association. And to my immediate left, your right, looking at me, is Mike Martelli, who's the President for Renewable Generation on Ontario Power. And our last panelist on the very end, who wants to be called Skelly. He's a Star Trek character. You may have read about in my colleague Russell Gold's excellent book, Superpower, One Man's Quest to Transform American Energy. And this is the man. Mike Skelly is the senior advisor at Lazard Frere. He was the founder and CEO of Cleanline Energy and currently serves as chairman still. And I'm going to start with you, Skelly, playing off the book's tagline. In a nutshell, what the heck happened with Cleanline?
Yeah.
10 years, a decade, and what did you learn?
Okay, before I jump into that, I just want to thank the Canadian Embassy for hosting us. Interestingly, we have a lot to learn from Canada on a couple of fronts. And if you all have not had the pleasure of going to Winnipeg, when you go to Winnipeg, you will learn that Winnipeg is the center for excellence in HVDC technology. Lots of super smart people there. On the technical front, on the financial front, there are a lot of, because of the pension scheme in Canada, there's a lot of liquidity that they want to invest in long-term assets, and so they're big investors in transmission in the United States and elsewhere. And then on the policy front, Canada they're supposedly sort of a little bit socialistic from time to time, but their approach to building transmission is often much more market-oriented than the approach that we take in the United States. And they've done some really innovative and interesting things, similar to what the Brazilians have done in terms of competitive auctions where people are bidding technical capabilities, cost of capital, cost of construction. All that goes into a pricing mechanism, and it results in projects that are delivered at a lower cost, and the risks associated with those projects are borne by the investors and others, and not so much by the rate base. So it's we have a lot to learn from our Canadian friends, and so it's really appropriate that they host this discussion. So I want to thank them for their leadership and obviously for the delightful treats that they're serving us all day long. But other than learning about Canada, what do we learn at Cleanline? Some of the lessons we learned are lessons that other people have learned. In some of the lessons I actually learned after reading the book, which is maybe I should have learned them before we read the book, but the importance of national level leadership. So if you look at the Pacific Intertie, which is one of the backbones of the Western grid, that was built, proposed in the early 1960s in a speech by JFK. And that project ultimately got built. It involved lots of horse trading among Western states and so on, but it got built with not just sort of secretarial leadership, but at the presidential level. And that's important, and it's something that we need, and hopefully that we'll see in years ahead. The other lesson is that we may have been too early, and if you look at how transmission gets built around the world, we often enough, or far too often, we build the generation first, okay? So in the example of the Northwest, they built all this hydro, and they said, oh gee, I guess we only have so many smelters that we can build. Let's build a transmission line down to Los Angeles because we've got this big city with growing load, and we can better optimize the whole system with the intertie. And that was one of the impetuses behind the construction of the Pacific Intertie. Now the good news in the United States is we are doing exactly that again, in particularly with respect to renewables. And we have a huge renewable expansion taking place, particularly in the center of the country, driven by technology innovation, a super low interest rates with a big, a huge, big search for yield amongst investors, even if the yields aren't great. And so they're building the transmission. Sometimes they're building it in places that, from a transmission perspective, it doesn't really make a lot of sense to build and now they're suffering curtailment and low prices and so on. But that generation getting built first, I believe, will provide the impetus for more transmission over the next decade or two. And we sort of, I had been knocking around the wind industry for many years before starting Cleanline, and we sort of thought that would happen, and we said this is happening, et cetera. But sometimes people need to see it actually happening before they realize, wow, we got to do something about this problem, as opposed to a projected problem. So we were a little bit early. We thought that and by the way, on the book, I'm going to talk a little bit about the book. I encourage y'all to read it. Skip the chapters that talk too much about me, but read the grid stuff. I have no economic interest in the book, just to be clear. But Russell Gold spent years putting this thing together, and we want people like him to write books about sort of nerdy topics in hopefully an interesting way, and then those topics will be. So we want to encourage Russell and others to write books like that, because these are topics that need exploring beyond the confines of rooms like this. So in any event, we sort of thought that the Obama administration would be really keen on this project. It took us, literally years of wandering around the halls of the Forrestal building. So we did this thing where we'd get one meeting in the morning at DOE, and that would get you into the building. And once you're in the building, you can sort of, I don't know if you can still do this, but you could wander all over the place and ask people, will you be my friend? Will you look at this project, talk to me, et cetera? And we made a few friends that way, but it was super frustrating in the first term of the administration. When Secretary Moniz came in, he was less sort of technology focused, more project and sort of let's build things focused. And so things changed. And once DOE picked up our permit application, things, sort of soup to nuts on NEPA approval, participation agreement, and all that was, under 4 years, which is actually fairly quick. The other thing that we learned, we learned a lot of stuff, is that, the obvious stuff about community outreach and getting out there early and often, you can't do enough of that. You just can't. It's sort of like running a political campaign. There's not enough hours in a day, there's not enough money, there's not enough anything to do all of the outreach that you want to do. And so we could have done more. The other important thing that we learned is that the NEPA process, and this is getting a little wonky, so I'll stop with this, is actually, for those of you all who've dealt with NEPA, that's the federal permitting authority. And they propose NEPA requires that you propose a bunch of alternatives, okay? And then you go sort of run these different alternatives by the public, and then you get feedback and you pick the best one. That sounds great in theory, okay? But what it turns out is that, we would be doing notifications. We'd send out literally 45,000 notification letters, when at the end of the day, we were only going to need 2,000 landowners, okay? So if you tell 45,000 people that there's a possibility that they get a transmission line, a decent enough percentage of those will be quite upset. And many of our most, vociferous opponents were people that got that letter, and we were 10 miles away from them. But they just decided that, they got involved in opposing the project and made a bunch of new friends and believed in their hearts of hearts that this was a terrible thing, and they dedicated, this was sort of their thing to do for a number of years. So the NEPA process, while the intentions are good in terms of getting the public input, also has, I think, the inadvertent effect of stirring up dramatically more opposition than might be the case if you were able to go through it a different way. And in other states and jurisdictions where we were able to use a more narrow approach, that helped a lot. So, but I'll stop with that, and I'll continue with more lessons learned as we go through the panel.
Okay, good. Well, thanks for that. Thanks for them. I want to pick up on your comment about how selling these lines is almost like a political exercise, because my observation has been in covering the industry is that they've been engaged in sort of a soft sell of why more transmission is needed. That is, it's tied to clean energy, which is tied to the benefits of zero carbon emissions, which is tied to fighting climate change. But in many parts of this country, those are fighting words. And I'm just wondering, I'd like to ask you if that's really the best strategy, or is a hard sell needed where forget those issues, they're good for people who believe in them, but why not sell this exclusively in most places where you need to as an economic development benefit, or even national security benefit? Amy, you've got some thoughts on this, I think.
Yeah, no, I think that's one of the things that we've been trying to do, particularly when you think about where the wind-rich states are in rural America and the amount of investment that wind development brings in. And at the end of the day, this transmission just opens up more opportunities. So it has been very much a rural economic investment message that we've been trying to continue to push forward. And I think the other thing it gets to, you mentioned that being, climate being fighting words. From our perspective, transmission should be very much a bipartisan issue. It's infrastructure. It lends to resilience and national security and American energy dominance and all those buzzwords, as well as this rural economic development in a lot of these very red states. I think over 80% of wind development is in Republican districts. So from that standpoint, it should be very bipartisan. We're trying to really drill home those messages. on that side. And then on the flip side, some of the opposition to transmission, I know Skelly can probably talk more about this, but if there are concerns from the environmental side and the left side, that's something where we have to also talk about transmission as an opportunity to hit these carbon and climate goals that are kind of that pinnacle, our apex predator of all issues, for a lot of folks on the Democratic side. So it's our job to do, I guess, a better job of messaging this to both sides and how there are net benefits across the board.
Are there any case studies you can point to about a particular wind project in recent years where the selling has been successful because of an economic development or a national security argument?
So I would say that the Central Maine project, the HVDC line from Canada into Maine, I mean, they have the support of Union of Concerned Scientists, a number of other environmental groups. There's a few environmental groups that oppose the project, but they've done they've apparently made sufficiently compelling arguments to get them to support. In general, I think on the environmental side, that discussion has changed because during the early 2000s or the 2000s, there was a lot of concern that transmission lines would enable coal plants to stay around longer. That's sort of not a big concern in the environmental community. Maybe there's folks here who are from that community who can speak more authoritatively than me. But we had the Sierra Club, Nature Conservancy, a whole raft of environmental groups that were super supportive of what we were doing. And I think that if we do a good job of citing and listening to their input in terms of land use and so on, staying away from protected areas, et cetera, we will continue to enjoy the support of the environmental community to get transmission built.
I think one other thing that's evolving too is as more and more of the Fortune 500 companies have sustainability goals, you're seeing them demand access to clean energy. So that actually changes the jobs dynamic and the jobs messaging as well. It's not just where the wind's getting deployed. Yeah. It's in the states where this transmission might bring the renewable power too. Because if you got to locate your manufacturing in a state and you got to meet your sustainability goals, you need that access. And so I think that's actually going to become a more and more powerful tool as we see. 2018 was a record year for C&I demand for renewable energy. I think it's like 8.5 gigawatts, another 6 gigawatts in 2019, and we're going to continue and expect to continue to see that grow. And I think that's only going to help on the public messaging as it becomes more apparent that that'll be a jobs driver.
So, say, Catherine, the same question I asked Amy initially. I mean, for SEIA, for the solar industry, is the soft cell approach being sort of adapted now to sort of address more red state concerns and making it more about economics and security and frankly, grid resilience?
Sure. Well, we have always enjoyed bipartisan support for solar, and 90% of Americans think that we need policies to deploy more solar in the country. That translates pretty well to our bipartisan support in Congress. But in terms of talking to really those local stakeholders, jobs are the number one consideration. And we've got 242,000 Americans in the U.S. solar industry now. We anticipate strong growth over the next decade. We've set out a goal to reach 20% of electricity generation from solar by 2030. That'll take us up to in the neighborhood of 600,000 jobs in the solar industry. So that is the number one driver for people's concerns. The nice thing about solar is that it's flexible. So rather than being simply restricted to one part of the country, as you know, we deploy on rooftops. We deploy as far north as Alaska, as far south as Hawaii. There's a wide variety of sizes and appropriate scale solar for different communities. And so we can tailor the projects a little bit more to what the community's desires and tolerance levels look like.
Mike, you are a representative from Canada here, and I really want to drill down for our audience, most of whom are, who here considers themselves just a U.S. attendee versus a Canadian? U.S. attendees, raise your hand. Okay, so it's mostly, you can educate these folks if you answer this question. So you've heard what Amy and Catherine have said about the U.S. industry. Give us a snapshot of Canada's renewable power resources. I mean, how extensive are they? I know they're mostly hydro, but and in terms of getting acceptance among the provinces and their customers for this. Has it been a hard sell versus soft sell issue, or has been more acceptance? Because I think typically Canada, they're still in the Paris Climate Accord. The new Prime Minister has certainly made climate change his #1 priority now for his current term. I mean, what's the snapshot for Canada's renewable power industry? And then I've got a couple more follow-ups.
Sure, and I'll answer that broadly, Canada, and maybe a little bit more specifically Ontario. I'd have to say it's been a relatively easy sell to build hydropower in Canada. When we do customer surveys or customer impact assessments, and we ask them what their priorities are in terms of the energy mix, hydro is always #1. Then it's wind and solar, and nuclear is #4. But another element of our development, which we heard Dr. Munez talk about, is social justice. We refer to it as social license. But in the 50s and 60s, our Indigenous communities were basically ignored and in many ways harmed by the construction of massive water power projects across the country. That's changed now. They're in the dialogue. They're part of the decision. They're partners, in fact. In our case, we have 5 Indigenous partners in Ontario, and it's these contracts. It's money they can take to the bank and borrow against it. And they're now coming to us saying, what's the next project that we can build? What's the next hydro project that we can build? Unfortunately, from a physical perspective, it's in the north. It's far north. Ontario, for example, from east to west is 2,000 kilometers. So from Kenora to Cornwall, 2,000 kilometers. And we've got plants, we have 66 stations. We have stations in between. North to south, from James Bay to Niagara Falls, is another 2,000 kilometers. And we're north-south, we're transmission constrained. We need more transmission. We have about another 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts of potential capacity, water power capacity in Northern Ontario. Quebec has the same. The country as a whole has capacity of about 81,000 megawatts and the capability to double that. Quebec can double theirs. Quebec is 40,000 megawatts. They have the capacity to double. Ontario is about 10,000. We have the capacity to double. Manitoba is about 6,000. They have the capacity to triple. So the energy's there. It's just getting it to the south, getting it to where the population is. And we have the support from the communities across Northern Ontario, in particular Indigenous communities, that want to be our partners and want to be a piece of the solution.
So you have 81,000 megawatts. What's the load generally? I mean, how much of that is surplus and available for export?
Yeah, exactly. I would say perhaps in general terms, maybe 10%. 10% of that can be available for surplus, but it's time of year. Quebec is peaks, has winter peaks, and Ontario has summer peaks. So Quebec in the summer, they have more to export than Ontario does, and vice versa.
See, this reinforces my theory about build a generation first. So you've built a generation, and now you need to get it to market.
Yeah, and here's what I'd say to that. We generally, by and large, we do that. Ontario Power Generation, however, is not a vertically integrated company. We used to be Ontario Hydro, and we were a vertically integrated company, and the government today thought it'd be best to split us up and try to privatize that industry. And so Hydro One is the line owner. In Ontario's case, we're the generator, or at least the biggest generator. But having said that, we still work hand in hand with Hydro One, and you're right, we won't build a large power station unless we have some idea that there's going to be adequate transmission line there. And the OEB is our regulator, Ontario Energy Board is our regulator. So the three of us are in discussions in longer term planning, whereas Quebec and Manitoba, our neighbors, they're vertically integrated, so they can do that entire planning from start to finish themselves.
So even though you're a government agency and you can build when you want to,
right?
Doesn't sound like you subscribe to Skelly's theory that build the generation first and then the lines will come. Line siting in Canada, tell folks here how that works. I mean, in the United States, we have a federal regulator that has tries to have a role. That's the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in line siting.
Right.
But in Canada, it's all province by province, correct?
Correct. The province has a jurisdiction over line development. So remember I said having geography is, the large geography is a problem. In this case, it makes it somewhat easier because most of that land is crown land until you get into the more populated centers. But once you get north a couple hundred kilometers of Toronto, it's pretty open and expanse and land that's owned by the Crown.
I mean, one of the issues in the United States has been, of course, interstate lines are harder to site because they're interstate. What happens in Canada when a line's going to cross between, say, Quebec and Ontario? I mean, is there a process that's sort of discrete that the provincial regulators use? I mean, how does that work?
There isn't a formal process, and it is a challenge. I think all the provinces put up barriers. They like to develop a homegrown solution, and I think that's where we have to change our thinking. And the true solution is going to be a more integrated approach. So we'd have to talk to Quebec and Quebec about us about interprovincial transmission lines, and we do the same with Manitoba.
So, from what you've said, it sounds like Quebec, in particular, and Ontario as well, have the greatest opportunity to maybe export power south to load centers in the U.S. Is that right?
Correct. But Manitoba they have potential as well.
Okay. So why isn't that happening?
Transmission lines north-south.
But is that a Canadian?
Well, I mean, it is happening with Manitoba, right?
Yeah.
It is probably not to the scale that they'd like, and there's more there available, but it has happened, and by and large, in small transmission lines in Ontario, for instance, they're planning to bury cable underneath Lake Erie from our Nanticoke station to get into the PGM market. So that is in the planning process.
That's an ITC project,
Correct.
which is also a Canadian company.
Correct.
Now, for those of you who may or may not be aware, but when a line wants to cross the Canadian border into the United States, it requires something called a presidential permit, which actually is reviewed by the Department of Energy. And there are only two criteria DOE uses to approve a presidential permit. And one is ascertaining whether the proposal would adversely affect the reliability of the U.S. electric power supply system under normal conditions. To put it another way, it's about the new buzz phrase, resilience and reliability. So I guess I'd like to ask, maybe Amy and Captain, you can address this, and Skelly too. Is there any concern that with the current administration's posture towards renewable energy, which could be described as, if not neutral, in some quarters hostile, that lines that would export renewable power from Canada to the United States might have a harder time obtaining a permit because they wouldn't be deemed support resilience because of the argument that they're intermittent? I mean, do you see any concern there from the solar or wind side?
So I haven't seen it, particularly, and maybe some others have seen such opposition, but particularly if you're talking about hydro, that's fairly firm capacity, so the intermittency would not be an issue. In fact, the Canadians would argue that having a big bank of hydro assets connected to our offshore wind is actually a good way to integrate more renewables in the U.S. So I don't think that's an issue, but I'm not a lawyer dealing with getting
I'm only
permits.
thinking about what Mike said, that the loads are different. I mean, the peaks are different
Yeah,
in Ontario and
yeah,
Quebec,
it's-
and so sometimes it might not be as available as others. Do you happen to know, Catherine, when the last presidential permit was actually applied for or reviewed?
No, that's not something our members have been involved in.
Okay.
Well, the last one that was, if I'm not mistaken, it was in Arizona, from Nogales to somewhere, and it went fairly quickly. The issue on the Mexican border is more an ERCOT issue, because ERCOT is always a little twitchy about further integration with other states. In fact, there was some case where, because the Mexicans had proposed a transmission line that would tie their grid, this is how crazy this stuff gets, but there was a proposed line between Baja California and Hermosillo, which is part of the Maine Mexican grid, and the ERCOT, the Texas concern, and full disclosure, I live in Houston. I was going to say go Astros, but I'm a little quiet about all that today.
You'll get booed off the stage by me.
So, in any event, the PUC raised the issue that if the Mexicans build this line, then ERCOT is going to have another indirect connection via the Mexican grid and then a DC line to WEC, and that might, FERC might like reach through all that and say, we're going to regulate you Texans. And so But so I believe there's a big opportunity for further integration with the Mexican grid, particularly given how much renewables we're building in Texas. But so far, people have been a little gun shy about proposing new projects, in part because there's a perception that it's difficult to get approvals on the Texas side of the border. The Mexicans would be happy to have the power.
Let me follow up on that with you. So obviously you had experience at Clean Line with dealing with the U.S. organized markets, which now probably take up, 65-70% of the geography of the United States. And they have their own discrete transmission planning processes, some of which are very cumbersome and take a long time. And the queues have, dozens, if not hundreds of projects sometimes of different sizes, many of which probably will never get built. I mean, do you have any, in your view, how the markets and their current structure and how they vet these lines, has that been supportive to the industry, or has it in many cases been a barrier to the development of transmission? And particularly based on your place at Lazard now, is the time it takes to review these lines an impediment to the financial community saying, yeah, we can buy into building that?
Yeah, so you talked about two things. One was the
Yes.
queue, okay? And the other is building new lines. And on the queue, I'll let Amy talk as much as she wants about queue reform. Personally, I think queue, if you're in the queue, that's an option. And sometimes those options are super cheap, like in Texas, where you don't actually get transmission rights when you get an interconnect. And I like that approach, like, hey, plug yourself in and, welcome to the ERCOT casino, and good luck, and you'll make money or not. But that feels to me like a good approach. In other areas, the queue comes with transmission rights and so on, and the ability to move power, so it gets more complicated, particularly in the context of capacity markets. But in any event, there is a reluctance among investors they're scared of congestion, and so it's sometimes not as scared as they should be, and we're talking about that a little bit at dinner last night. So if you show up at a bank and say, hey, I'm going to build this project, fantastic wind, we're about 75 miles north of Amarillo, it's just phenomenal capacity factor, you'll get laughed out of the bank because they know that you're going to suffer mightily from congestion, and your project will go bankrupt within a fairly short period of time. So yeah, the financial community is aware of this issue and but they never have and probably never will bet on like the hope that maybe someday transmission might get built. They're more cautious than that.
But doesn't that highlight, I think, the challenge if you do this generation-driven transmission investment versus the proactive planning for transmission? You're going to continue to have this problem. I think this is, if regulation and practice followed logic, we'd all be out of a job, but we'd also have a lot of net benefits there. You look at the recent Brattle study, you look at some of the old NREL studies on this, it's billions in savings if you do that proactive planning and build.
Yeah. By the way, my observation that we build the generation first and then think about transmission, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying it's something that we have done for the last 50, 75 years, and it happens in the United States. In China, they've done it with building lots of wind, and then saying, "Oh, gee, we got to connect this up." This happens in our world, okay? And it's only a good thing to the extent that we go, "Oh, wow, we got to go build this transmission because we just spent all this money on generation," and it's a bass-backwards way of getting to the right place, and people lose money along the way, but it does seem to happen, and it's sort of inexplicable, but it's happened enough that it's worth observing.
Can I say a word about resilience?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Sorry. We often talk about electricity like it's a very easy commodity to generate and to transmit when it's actually very complex. What other commodity is delivered in real time? And the real time poses all kinds of difficulties around grid stability and the delivery of ancillary products. And these things go unseen to many, but they're so important for the resilience and stability of the grid. Things like voltage support, things like ramp rate, things like automatic generator control. And we're seeing that real time in Ontario with the tremendous growth of the intermittents, both wind and solar. And if you have asked the ISO operators in the control room that are trying to manage this system, they love the hydropower assets, because hydropower assets picks up the ebbs and flows and provides voltage support when it's needed, either plus or minus, and provides the ramp rate when the wind's blowing up or the wind's blowing down. They rely on the water power assets to balance everything. So I think that's being undersold, and that's a product that this form of generation can enable other intermittents like wind and solar. And I'm not sure that's, I know it's not understood, and I'm not sure we're doing a good enough job selling that. And we should be talking about renewables as a package deal as opposed to one-ofs and just picking a lane. I don't think we can afford to pick a lane. I think we have to talk about these renewables together as a package.
But in Ontario, I mean, you're primarily hydro. You've got a small wind facility, I think, right? or a solar facility in the works. But it's not as if Ontario Power Generation is thinking about investing a lot in wind and solar, because hydro is just so plentiful and inexpensive.
Right now in Ontario, there's a surplus of capacity, but don't forget we also have nuclear. We have quite a large nuclear footprint. There's about 11,000 megawatts of nuclear in the province. But nuclear, as you probably know, loves to run flat base. They don't like any fluctuations. They want to run at full power and stay at full power for 3 years. And so then the resiliency is on the hydropower, the water power assets, and on the wind and solar. We have 6,000 megawatts of wind now and about 3,000 megawatts of solar. So there's quite a big energy mix that needs to be managed in Ontario.
I want to move on some questions about the markets, because there is a body of thought that despite the best efforts of the FERC, they've sort of dropped the ball in recent years for a lot of reasons on transmission. It was in July of 2011 when Chairman John Wellinghoff sort of led the issuance of Order 1000, and the purpose was to increase regional transmission development by eliminating monopolies and creating competition and incentives. All the things you all have been working on talking about for a while, and frankly what Clean Line was all about. And in particular, the FERC order said it was primarily to help state and local authorities meet their goals for lower emissions and for renewable energy. But it's almost as if Order 1000 has been sort of tossed aside. So Catherine and Amy, I mean, your organizations have commented countless times on aspects, not just Order 1000, of attenuated issues to the order and to transmission development. I mean, is FERC paying as much attention as they should be to this issue? And are they a barrier, or can you simply go around them by using RTO processes to do that?
Well, one, yes, all of this starts in the RTOs. Two, can you actually accomplish anything as a solar developer within an RTO stakeholder process? Very low likelihood of good outcomes there. I think more broadly, I mean, this goal of planning transmission to meet policy goals, planning for interregional transmission, these are the right goals, and nobody has cracked that nut yet on how to do it. We didn't do it well before 2011, we're still not doing it well. Case in point, you know, we have been very vocal about our 20% solar deployment goal by 2030. Transmission plans that are being crafted right now go out to what, like 2029, 2030? Outside of California, nobody, no future scenario, not a single one, has 20% solar in it. Some of them don't even have 20% renewables in them. So making sure that the front end work that we do in the transmission planning process is, you know, we have to turn a corner here and radically rethink what goes into those transmission planning scenarios. And we have to plan for a rapidly decarbonizing future. And that is hard for people. A lot of the planners want to be very conservative. There's not, I mean, I think that there's a great track record of the wind industry consistently outperforming what those transmission plans expected wind generation to deliver within those 10-year windows. So we should take the opportunity to learn from that, match some of those future growth scenarios. There's a lot of new pieces coming into the electricity sector over the next decade. We're undergoing rapid change, but if we are not planning for rapid change, we will consistently make plans that are behind the commercial reality.
Amy, what's the perspective of the wind sector?
I would echo a lot of what Catherine said. It is challenging, and you are going to need, a role. There is going to be a role for FERC because each of the RTOs has its own set of modeling parameters and modeling assumptions. So it's great to say coordinate and have the coordination meeting, but until you align both, how forward-looking it is, what are the public policy, economic, and reliability benefits, all of those considered at the same time that you're going to consider in your planning process, and some of the base assumptions and the principles around, is any generation sort of automatically, is there a cost allocation across the board automatically for added new generation, or how do you divide that up? All those things have to align across RTOs, and that's tough. And I think what you see is a reluctance from FERC to kind of reopen that and bite off that big piece of the apple or elephant. I don't know whatever we're talking about, but so what we are looking at now, they are looking at the the incentives and what can be done to make sure we can maximize the capability on existing generation. But there hasn't been this desire to really open up Order 1000, and that's one of the things that we've been doing and collectively been pursuing. With folks on the Hill and with the administration directly, in terms of you've got to look beyond just incentives and existing transmission improvements and start looking toward fixing this planning process. Because until you do, you're leaving. It's not about enabling renewable deployment as much as it is you're leaving money on the table. And part of FERC's mandate is to help drive for this lowest cost solution, and we don't have a process that's solving for that right now.
Before Skelly jumps in, but what Amy's referring to, if you don't follow FERC that closely, the chairman, 6 or 8 months ago, opened a proceeding to look at the returns on equity for transmission projects because over the course of, I guess what we call Democratic chairman, the ROEs came down, and now the industry would like to see those ROEs increase a bit more. But that's all they're doing is looking at financial returns. They're really not looking at the fundamentals behind Order 1000 and what role FERC could play in enabling sort of multi-state, across many states, large backbone projects. Skelly, you wanted to talk about this?
Yeah. So I'm not going to talk about ROEs because I work for an investment bank now. Look, we shouldn't pick on Terry Boston, particularly with Brenda here, but and Terry is not actually a good example of this, but the turf wars and feuds between RTOs are legendary, okay? And MISO and SPP, these people, for reasons that are often lost in the midst of time, they don't really like each other that much, and they don't work well together. And so the notion that FERC's going to pass something, say, hey, you guys, coordinate and work together and so on. I mean, come on. It has not happened, and it's not going to happen because they've got a bunch of other loop flow issues and other things that they're fighting about, so they're not going to sit down and figure this out. So we got to come up with a new way. It turns out that it may take an act of Congress, which was quite heartening to hear Senator Heinrich say that that's what he wants to do, is pass legislation to force this issue. And the other thing that I think that we need to do is create the opportunity for other mechanisms to force change. And if you look at what happened on the generation side to force change in the generation mix, it was a really important law called PURPA. And what PURPA said was new players can come in, and there are lots of imperfections, and avoided cost calculations were off, et cetera, and there are windfalls that maybe shouldn't have happened, et cetera. But it forced change in the system. And on the transmission planning side, if I were king for a day, I'd say, look, create a mechanism where independent transmission companies can propose projects, give them incentive rates if it's merited, and require that the RTOs study these things on a timeline and quantify the benefits and then make them out. But make that a more important part of the equation, because if independents in there pushing for it, you can count on the incumbent saying, hey, wait a minute, we want some of that too, and they'll start working on it as well. So we need to create outside pressure mechanisms to force some of these discussions to get these projects done. One last point on this, because we live this at Clean Line is, and I'll use the example of Missouri, which after 7 years, our Grain Belt project probably finally got approved. But you know, the average tenure of a commissioner in the United States at a state level is like 3 years. Yeah. So in their old world, a utility shows up and say, hey, we want to build this line, and they look at the rate impact, and is it going to do what, are they going to piss off the neighbors, et cetera. There's a social compact that everybody kind of, things happen and things get done, and if they screw it up, then they can get them back somewhere else, and life goes on. Then we have a new world where these, in the case of Missouri, these people from MISO, which is somewhere in Indiana, they show up in Jefferson City and they say, yeah, Ameren asked us to come in and testify about this line, and we think it's necessary because of this and this, and it's part of this whole plan. And the commissioners go, okay, well, like Ameren likes them, and these MISO people, they're keeping the lights on they're doing a pretty good job. Okay, line approved, off we go. Then these Texans show up and they say, well, we got this line that's going to go from Kansas to Indiana. It's going to provide these benefits. And they said, well, okay, that's great. What does Ameren say about this? Well, they don't have an opinion. And maybe they don't even like it all that much. And then MISO shows up, and they call MISO and they say, hey, what do you think about this interregional line, and how does this fit in your plans? And they're like, we have no opinion on that project, other than to say that we are studying them in the interconnection queue. So all the sort of third-party validators or social compacts that we had in place to sort of make decisions around the merits of these projects, they're not there. So all they've got is, these Texans and whatever coalition we've been able to round up, which we were able to do. I mean, we had the labor unions and Walmart and GM and C&I customers and manufacturers and so on. And that finally sort of got the job done. But if you have to go replicate the social contract, if you will, every time you want to do a new transmission line, it's really hard. So just to round out this comment, we need policy mechanisms so that the RTO shows up and FERC shows up. Somebody needs to show up from some sanctioned body to say, yes, this makes sense. Because otherwise, it's just too hard to get it done.
Okay, Catherine and Amy, Leslie Skelly said was FERC's got to show up. Are they showing up? I mean,
no, they
both your
hate
jobs is to
telling
talk to
state
FERC.
regulators what to do.
Yeah.
Like that is a fate worse than death for most FERC commissioners, usually because it does mean death of their political careers. But Skelly has accurately described what happens in these proceedings. The challenge is, and everybody's got to do a better job telling this story, is where are the benefits for those consumers, for the consumers who live in my state as a state regulator. This is what I'm thinking about. And the challenge is that it's easy to identify the cost of a transmission line and the big question of who is going to pay for that. It's much harder to say, look, ratepayers are already being overcharged for their generation right now. This, $12 billion investment will alleviate or reduce generation charges by $60 billion. I mean, that's a trade-off that I think a lot of people are interested in exploring, but a lot of regulators aren't asking that question.
Right, that is exactly the point. I'm glad you said that, because right now, the only party that's going to show up in a proceeding with an independent developer is the consultant that the developer has hired. And if you have a FERC process or an RTO process, the RTO doesn't have to say, we're paying for this, but the RTO could say, we've looked at this, we run the grid, this has this much benefits in dollars and cents. Or FERC could also play that role. But a third party that is sanctioned in some way, shape, or form by the government would be super helpful.
Amy, do you have a perspective on that in terms of what FERC should be doing if they have a greater role here?
You know, no, I echo all that these guys said. I guess I wanted to maybe throw another question to you, Skelly, in terms of, you know, what about the notion, because we're talking about changes that we could do to, you know, make this more likely to happen legislatively or not. What about the notion or the idea that, you know, if we could get a commitment for, you know, DOE to exercise its existing authority, say a project, you could take it to them, proactively align as opposed to a broad swath like the original designation.
Yeah.
And if you were to get that, them to adapt that, so, you know, a company comes to them, they could say, yeah, this is in the national interest, designated that, and then kick it to FERC and have FERC, I mean, FERC be willing to and say they will exercise their authority. I mean, I feel like that is something absent congressional changes pushing as well. I wanted your thoughts on.
Yeah, so I think this is, in all cases, we're talking about backstop authority because everybody would prefer to go through a state process as opposed to a federal process. So you're going to give it a go at the state level. Then at the federal level, there are bits and pieces and scraps of federal authority to cite interstate transmission. Some of them reside at DOE. DOE is not the right place because DOE, there are more studies and science and so on. It really ought to be FERC, and FERC is in the business of permitting things. So DOE has the ability to delegate that authority to FERC, and I know it's been an AWIA agenda item for many years now. So bringing in that FERC as a citing party whenever possible is a good idea because they're used to this kind of thing.
So Mike, you just heard this 10-minute exposition by the three panelists about the chaos in the United States when it comes to planning. I mean, what's it like in Canada? I mean, you've got independent system operators. Are they preeminent when it comes to planning lines that are needed, or do political provincial concerns, as they do in the United States, often get in the way of what the experts want to do?
I thought up until a few minutes ago that our process was very political and very difficult.
You're welcome.
Listening to this, I'll take our process any day, and it's likely because the provinces have 100% jurisdiction. There is no federal body overseeing any type of approvals for either generation or transmission, and so it's a much easier discussion. And it's a discussion where we can talk more about, because it's provincially, you can talk more about the benefits, the economic benefits, the jobs, the benefits to First Nations and other communities, and it's all that information is used in making that informed decision at a provincial level. Still a lot of work, an awful lot of work, but there's only one person, or there's only one group that we have to convince.
And does the regulator have backstop authority to cite a line over NIMBY objections?
Yes.
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 In
yes,
every
they
province?
do. In every province. I believe every province. I can speak certainly for Ontario, and there's others here from Manitoba and Quebec, but they have that.
Is that right, Manitoba and Quebec?
Yeah. It depends if it's interprovincial. If it's interprovincial, then you can get a federal involvement. But if it's strictly provincial and doesn't have any sometimes waterways or other implications that would require a federal license, then it's more straightforward.
Yeah.
Okay,
You guys were smart enough to organize your provinces in a north-south fashion. That was
Perhaps. Sometimes it's a challenge.
I mean, if you look here, though, if you look to the experience of the pipeline industry, I think it's 10 to 1 in terms of the ratio of pipelines cited, pipeline miles versus transmission miles cited. Wow. And I think that reflects, at least in the U.S., you do have the federal jurisdiction. I mean, I've worked in that world before. You have your subscription for your line, you go in, here's the demonstration of need, you get your, I mean, it's not that easy, but then your FERC is your permitting authority. It's very different than what Skelly et al. Went through, which you should all read about in his book.
It's a wonderful book. Let me ask let me ask you a question about, are there other market-related concerns you might have that are maybe not as prominent as what you just spoke about, but in the background are sort of holding back renewable development and therefore transmission development. I'm thinking about price formation. I mean, there's been so much written in the past couple of years about the fact that in many areas of the country now, you've got not just sort of flat prices, but negative prices, and it affects the dispatch stack, and it affects the viability of traditional resources like nuclear, and it throws everybody sort of into their respective corners, and they get very defensive over what renewables are doing to prices, and prices in the end also can affect the economics of a state. I mean, is price formation sort of one of these very subtle and complex barriers that needs to be worked on in order to be able to value renewables in a more general sense among the entire power sector? Because those who don't have them now wish they did, and the benefits of that. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Do you want to go first? Or do you want me to?
Go ahead. This is,
Yeah, I mean,
hopefully you figure this out.
Yeah, I think this is something that, you know, if you go to these, I've been to a number of seminars on this very topic, and I think there's a general recognition that we do need to reform the energy markets, as well as put more into the ancillary services markets, and valuation of sort of those grid reliability and other services that are provided. And it is a break from sort of the traditional, you know, how you get pricing in the market. And I think irrespective of solving that, you do see people going back in their corners, and you end up with an over-reliance on capacity market, or things that are, you know, valuing things that aren't necessarily going to be contributing to resilience. I think there was the proposal that DOE put out, it was like a year and a half ago now, right? It was, you know, all about if you can, you know, physically see the fuel, that means you're, you know, resilient, things like that are not actually contributing to resilience. And so, you know, from our standpoint, from a renewable standpoint, and I actually just think from the sort of consumer goods standpoint, we really need to focus instead on the delivered service, and setting up an energy market, ancillary services market that value that, that provides it, lets value that service, and let everybody compete to provide those services.
Yeah, so this is super interesting. Charlie, where's Charlie? Charlie's in the back there. There's entire conferences on just this topic. So, but just for the uninitiated, in case you want to go to one of these conferences, all of the energy markets that we have were predicated on, you're going to have a supply stack, and less and less efficient units would get dispatched as power consumption went up, right? And price formation happens because you've got a unit that's, you know, has a low cost, and then up you go up the ladder. Okay, if all units have zero cost, it's really hard to get price formation, and we're living in that world. Like that, the other day you mentioned SPP at 75%. That was a tricky price formation day, and I'm pretty sure that price was really, really low. And so, as Amy points out, clearly the answer has to involve moving money from the energy markets into other types of market. Is it a capacity market? I don't know, because those can be fairly static, to use a nice term. So this is a big one, and unfortunately, renewables are bearing the brunt of some of this discussion, not just renewables, but the production tax credit. So people blame the production tax credit for the fact that, you know, we have super low prices at times. It's actually not that. If you have hydro or solar or wind or nuclear, whose variable cost is like zero or next to zero, you're going to have this phenomena, and we're going to have a huge revisit to how all of our energy markets work before we get this figured out. And then, but Charlie maybe will tell us exactly how this works during the Q&A.
Okay.
Well, and I would add that these are important issues inside organized markets. Still, a third of the country has not seen the advantage to those organized markets. And I am not the first person to mention it, Skelly did it first, but PURPA continues to be the one glimmer of competition that you can bring to the rest of the country where we do not have organized RTOs and ISOs. And the proposed rule that FERC put out last month, you know, and various moves by state commissions and utilities, I think have been taking us in for sure the wrong direction in terms of promoting development of qualified facilities, cogeneration facilities, and renewables.
But another big driver too has been the consumer demand. I mean, it's not about megawatts anymore. It's been about zero emission megawatts, and so that's been another evolving big driver outside.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, in Canada, how much that's an interesting point that Amy made, because it's not just consumers, it's not just your grandparents who want solar panels so they can afford it. It's Walmart, it's GM, and it's hospitals and universities. I mean, obviously, I know you don't have a lot of government-owned solar,
Right.
particular and wind, but our institutions, our large consumers, stepping in with their own distributed energy generation in Canada.
Talking about it, we're not there yet.
Only talking about it.
Talking about it, we're not there yet in terms
Why are you so
of
behind?
full
You're always ahead of us by years.
Yeah, there you go. This is where maybe we are ahead of you, though, or not. You try to let the market decide on direction, but there's some things that society values that a market might not necessarily address, or at least not fast enough. So right or wrong, the Ontario took the bully approach, if I could use that term, when they introduced renewables, and they introduced a feed-in tariff, because there was no market. Everyone in Ontario was either contracted or regulated. If they relied on the market, and we have a lot of hours of negative pricing, the market would not support any intermittence. So it had to be forced. And these feed-in tariffs, through the feed-in tariffs, we now stand with 6,000 megawatts, as I said, of wind and 3,000 of solar. And if I could say, prices went up about 40%, and people were terribly upset until it was socialized more around. Ontario is leading the way, certainly leading the country in coal closure. We have no coal. We had 7,000 megawatts of coal in Ontario, and because of that initiative, we have zero. Since 2014, we haven't had any coal. And the government made the decision to have the ratepayer pay for renewables and not the taxpayer. I think what I'm hearing here is some of the incentives, the burden's on the taxpayer, not the ratepayer. But Ontarians seem to be warming up to the idea that, for instance, our federal election this past Monday, when people were interviewed on the street about what's their number one issue, it's climate change. It wasn't their taxes. We're tremendously taxed. We have our incremental tax rate in Canada is 54%. We have very high taxes. It wasn't taxes. It wasn't healthcare. It was climate change. For most people, climate change was their number one issue. So I think people are starting to get used to it. I believe people in Ontario are starting to get proud of the fact that I looked this morning. There's an app, Electricity Grid, and it tells you on kind of hour by hour basis what your carbon content is in your electricity. This morning, Ontario was at 20 grams per kilowatt. 20 grams per kilowatt. A coal plant like Poland is about 1,000 grams per kilowatt. California is about 400 grams per kilowatt. Places like Quebec, however, are probably zero, and Manitoba is zero. But we're very proud in Ontario that through closing the coal plants and introducing renewables and some significant hydro as well, we're down to 20 grams, 25 grams per kilowatt. So that was a very different approach, more of a political approach than a market approach.
Okay. Yes, Amy.
I just want to you're talking about the ratepayer, the taxpayer, who's paying. I think from my perspective, if I step back and look at it from just sort of a big picture, right now we have, our argument is what's preventing, there are billions of dollars in investment sort of in the wings for this transmission investment, and we've got government blocking it, and because of that, you've got ratepayers, paying extra in essence, because they don't have access to the lowest cost power that can be delivered at any given time. And so I think that's the paradigm, and that's the way we need to talk about this, because that's in reality what's happening.
Yeah.
I know there are probably questions from the audience, and I want to get to those in a minute or two. We have about 17 minutes left. But before I do, last night Senator Heinrich talked about the balkanization of policies at the state level and the lack of a federal energy policy as contributing to this inability to achieve at least the goals he wants to, that Skelly talked about. And I want to ask you, because in some ways the power sector seems happy without a national energy policy. The major IOUs that operate over 6 or 7 states are doing their own thing, closing coal plants, investing in solar, reforming the way they devise rates if the regulators will allow them to do that. At the same time, there is also a body of thought that says that elections matter, that who the president is, who members of Congress are, can affect the fortunes of the solar industry or the wind industry or hydro development or certainly the building of transmission lines. And I know that you may be reluctant to do this because the 2 lobbyists we have here, and that's kind of what you really do. How do you feel about sort of the need for maybe politics to step into the breach because we have this balkanized system where, 15, 20 states are racing ahead and the rest are kind of waiting around to see what else happens? I mean, are the outcomes of the next election, next November, at the federal level going to make a big difference in terms of how your plans are executed over time for your companies?
I mean, the short answer here is yes. Elections matter, policies matter. They change the trajectory, they change the speed at which anything gets deployed or any change to official rules or even the unofficial rules happens. So, from 2009, for that stretch of 8 years, we had a real vision of decarbonizing and bringing clean energy to the fore, making investments at DOE and in other kind of policy places. That has significantly slowed in the last couple of years. There are always other threads, right? States and cities and individual companies are making commitments to where their energy is going to come from, making financial investments, setting out targets, and they're shooting at them. So there's the one trajectory that says decisions outside of the federal government are going to continue to push forward on decarbonizing the electricity sector. But could it go faster? Could it go smoother? Could it come with money? That all relies on the federal trajectory, absolutely.
Amy.
Yeah. I mean, I generally agree with what Catherine said, and obviously these state decisions and state moves are driving investment. It's provided, Skelly can talk to this, but it kind of provides that certainty for the investment. Obviously, if there's a national level policy, that in some sort of law, that will also, bolster that. And when I hear the big institutional organizations, their concern is really about certainty over the appropriate time horizon and sort of the glide path. That's what it gets down to. It's not being for or against, it's really about the how. And that's where I do think a thoughtful federal policy is going to have significant advantages, because it will put that certainty out there and that glide path out there and provide certainty that we have to make these transmission investments, for example, to meet these goals, and renewable deployment investments to meet these goals, and that will be a net positive over the state of things today.
Right now, where federal energy policy happens is inside the tax code. I mean, it's entirely counterintuitive, but that is the one mechanism that you can go look at and say, what are we doing to promote infrastructure investments? What are we doing to promote renewable investments? What are we doing to promote, oil and gas investments? And there's a section of the tax code, carbon capture technologies. There's pieces in there that drive at these policy outcomes that exist in the tax code, even if we can't get them on any kind of document called U.S. National Energy Policy.
Well, Skelly.
Pieces is a key point, and
Yeah,
that's the
absolutely.
challenge. There are pieces everywhere, and I think at the end of the day, it behooves us to have it rolled in and have some common, tax policy, because you do want, from a standpoint that if it's going to move through tax policy, great, but let's put everybody in the same bucket, in the same section, and that way we can get sort of an economic deployment, and all the resources can compete to provide that zero emission electricity.
So Skelly, is Captain right that if you have sort of the right kind of federal policies, things can go faster and smoother? I mean, you were building your company and proposing your projects at a time when you had a sympathetic administration and to some degree a sympathetic Congress for a couple of years, and yet still it didn't work out the way you would have liked.
Yeah, I mean, look, on these big projects, you just know that you're stepping into, with long time frames, you're stepping into change of administration risk. We lived it because we went and met with Secretary Perry after the election and said, you know, kind of check in. And he's like, we're not doing this. We're like, what? No, but that was the other guys. We got a signed agreement with DOE, and he said they're not doing it. So that's kind of a bad day at the office.
Yeah. All right. There must be questions. Raise your hand if you want to ask a question. The microphones are on either side. Just identify yourself first, unless we've answered everything already. That can't be possible. Here we go.
Dan Prose at Manitoba. There has been some talk of a glide path and decision makers having some vision of how we can get to the future that we all want. Having not just a vision, but actually having a plan that says this is the way we can put the pieces together. Well, I mean, we know hydro there's a lot available in Canada, and it has all kinds of advantages. But it's not cheap. And it does have a lot of Aboriginal negotiations issues with it that have to be worked out. We know that wind can be very inexpensive. Sometimes solar is very attractive, cheaper than hydro, but it's not dispatchable. And we know that energy storage has a role. We know that loads that follow price has a role. We know that transmission has a role. But we don't seem to have any studies or any plan to say, if we looked at the continent and basically said, this is the best way to meet this kind of objective. DOE has tried to do some studies. They remain unpublished or whatever, or certainly unpromoted. What do you see that we need? Something that pulls all the pieces together to say, decision makers, this is a vision that you could build your glide path on. Do we need that? And secondly, if we do, is there a way to get there?
Are you talking about an integrated North American energy market?
Whether you look, no, not necessarily. I'm just saying, how do you put pieces together? Certainly there are issues you raised related to markets. Market reform is all part of that. But, and even whether it's just US or whether it's US and Canada, do we need that? Do we need that plan? That's part of my bias. I think we do. But do you agree that something like that would be needed or useful? And if so, is there a way to get there?
So this is maybe a false construct, but what you're saying, like, we need this North America-wide plan that says lines here, generation there, et cetera, right? I don't think that actually may be a good idea. And it could be done in China or France, where you've got, sort of single protagonists and integrated entities, and which may be like what we ought to have. We ought to have like one utility for North America. Then it would start acting like a utility. That might not be so great, but I don't think it's going to play out like that. I do think we're going to get there, but and I'm actually, maybe I'm not supposed to be optimistic, but I'm super optimistic that we're going to figure this stuff out. Maybe not in time, but we're going to make a lot of progress. And I think the answer is probably more like we want to get to like large percentage of renewables. So we'll do some combination of some production incentives plus carbon tax light plus C&I demand, and then we'll lean heavily on markets in most of the country to sort of find our way there. And, hard-headed, obnoxious people will go try to ram their project through, and y'all in Canada will work on your projects, and the offshore people do, and it'll kind of come together, and it might actually look a little bit like the plan that you articulate, because the economics will drive us in that direction. But I don't think a plan it's just not how we roll. So
for clarification, I'm thinking more European Union than China.
Yeah,
for clarification.
okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, my reaction was the same as Skelly's. I'm like personally itchy and twitchy about the notion of the government will provide some master plan that's the best solution. In my mind, if you get the goal set out there in a common agreement on the goal, then that's going to suddenly reveal the value and the price of these kind of investments. And you get the barriers out of the way. Once that value is recognized, get the regulatory barriers out of the way, and let the market kind of drive. Let the market drive the lowest cost solutions. I think that is.
Yours might work better, by the way, but I just don't think we're going to do it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you. Is there anyone else? Yeah.
Hi, Bill White with CTC Global Corporation. So my question is, having been at this a long time myself, like many of you, pushing transmission as a solution on climate, I was struck by something you said, Catherine, about that the planners, the RTOs, aren't looking at these high renewable scenarios in a routine fashion, and so that informs designs and solutions at the level of an individual line or lines or sets of lines that really are going to look a lot different as we ramp up to ever higher levels of renewables. And my sense is, 10, 15 years ago, there wasn't a consensus on the very much higher levels of renewables. My sense is there's a much bigger consensus in the industry and more broadly in society about that, where we're going, and yet it's still not there with the planners. So what are the, given that I think the world has changed in some positive ways, I share Skelly's optimism in that regard. How does that inform our asks on the policy side? So we have, the great news from Senator Heinrich last night, and we have some encouraging words from Congressman Tonko this morning. But are we asking for the right things now, as opposed to what we asked for 10 years ago, or are we? What do we need to be asking for? What do we need to be looking for, and adjust our asks and our expectations based on where we are now?
Great question. Yeah, many of you in this room have sat around the same conference room table since at least 2008 talking about these issues. The RTO planning level, and even just, WEC, they're not a market, but they do plenty of transmission planning. That's really a ground game. So that takes resources from companies, that takes some vision and some participation from elected officials, from policymakers, to say, no, really, this is what the future looks like. Nope, we're doing this kind of economic investment. We need X outcomes. That's very disconnected from what happens here in DC. So for all of the great comments this morning from Mr. Tonko, his vision has not yet been adopted by the transmission planners. And so for all of you who are working in these markets or who want to be investing in these markets, my plea is get engaged, go to these RTO stakeholder meetings, demand that your vision of the future gets much more airtime and consideration in the transmission planning processes. We continue to do this on an incremental basis. We are missing the boat on how many renewables get deployed, what gets put on the distribution grid side of the system, and adjusting for changes in usage patterns that will be driven by building electrification, electric vehicles, et cetera. If we're making 10-year and 12-year plans and driving investment decisions for the future, we really need to be clear about what that future is going to look like, which is not incrementally different than today, but substantially different.
Skelly gets the last word.
Okay, so we've done this. In the mid-2000s, in SPP, you had Missouri with a renewables referendum and X percentage. Kansas had a goal. Oklahoma had a goal. Texas had an RPS. SPP said, okay, we get it. We're adding these things up. We need this much wind, and let's build these priority projects, which were actually old legacy plans from another era, but they actually fit really well with what where wind would get built. And those projects got built. In MISO, they added up all the RPS across Michigan and Minnesota, et cetera, et cetera. They said, oh, wow, we got this much more renewables. We need a plan to do this. The RTOs can figure this stuff out. They're figuring it out in California. They're not doing it at SPP yet because, and it's not because the people, these are super smart people in Little Rock. And they could, if you ask them, they'll say, yeah, just tell me what you want done. I will do that plan. They'll figure it out. But it's not this is a political decision. And so if we get the right sort of political decision and the economic impetus behind C&I demand, et cetera, we can figure out the right plan. They do drag their feet a little bit when it comes time to talking to their neighbors, but we already talked about that part. But we've done this before, we can figure it out. And a very bright spot in that is like when Minnesota passes 100% renewable energy goal, that will help drive the planning process. It's not helping as much as many of us would hope, but when those things happen, then the message kind of gets through to the RTOs and off they go.
Agree with all that. Thanks.
Well, thank you all very much for coming and staying here for 90 minutes. I know it's a lot to ask. Give the panel a hand. They've worked hard.